Well, welcome everybody to week 3 of the midweek debrief. Our topics for today are science, guns, and kindness. So that's going to be the week 3 agenda for this midweek debrief. So, it's funny. I'm really enjoying this format of the midweek debrief, and somebody different. It's not scheduled, but every week somebody joins me for this conversation. And so you may hear a voice from time to time. But I'm really enjoying debriefing what happens. A lot happens around here on the weekend, and it's nice sort of midweek to check in and talk about some of it. And you'll see why, I think, especially today, because during my sermon, I cut my sermon short on Sunday. And I sort of wish I hadn't, and I want to tell you why. But first, we're going to talk about science, then guns, then kindness. So let's talk about science. So at our brainstorming session, which is what we call Sunday school, BS with Bo at 9:30 in the morning, our topic for the week was science and religion, or science and faith. And we might talk in a second about why certain people didn't like the article, but it didn't matter because we didn't actually ever get to the article. So I post on Thursday, at minimum, sometimes Wednesday or Thursday, I post what we're going to be talking about the coming week. And then people read it, and then they show up, and I ask them to be caffeinated and opinionated on Sunday mornings. And so that happened this week. So, for instance, the ESPYs read the article about science and faith that I had posted from a website called Ministry Matters. 3 articles about science and religion. And the ESPYs came and said, who sent you that article? Because we don't want to offend them, but that guy doesn't understand the scientific method, or he didn't represent it well, which I thought was sort of a hilarious way to get started. And I said, you don't need to worry about offending anybody. I'm on the mailing list for that website, and so I found that and brought it, so you don't have to worry about offending anybody, which I thought was very kind to say. Like, for instance, let's say that Linda had sent that in, and then if you all had come in and said, that article stunk, then Linda would have been like, hey, I really liked that article, and I wanted to talk about it. Welcome. Is it snowing where you are?
No, we don't. We're only getting rain.
Okay. You're not outside.
We haven't seen any snow yet.
Oh, here. Okay. All right. Well, that should be fun when it gets there.
We had nothing but back-to-back snowstorms when I ran a homeless shelter and had to wear guns for days, and we can't really get any snow now.
All right. Well, I'm glad you're here for this, because our topics for today are science, guns, and kindness, all 3 of which I'm hoping you have something to say about. Okay. So in Sunday school, we're talking about science, and a really fascinating thing happened. So sometimes in Sunday school, I am presenting an idea. So I do the majority of the talking. But much of the time, I actually get the luxury of becoming a co-learner, because we are a conversational community, and there's so much wisdom in the room that I, get to facilitate the conversation, and I often get to step back and just listen to people much wiser than I am, who have different experiences than I do, and some have longer track records, and so they bring something to the table, and I actually leave with, more than I came in with. It's awesome. And that's definitely what happened this past week. In fact, one of the exciting things that happened in Sunday morning is that some people who normally don't come to Sunday school came just for the subject. They wanted to talk about science. And so an interesting thing happened. So I started by asking the question, A, do you feel like you understand science? And B, do you trust science? It's basically all I said, for the most part, for the rest of the Sunday school session, because it turns out an amazing thing. When you didn't grow up in an environment like I did, where you are taught that science and faith are either adversarial or need to be reconciled or something, you don't start in a deficit of feeling like you need to reconcile these two things, when you're not presented science and religion as combatants, you don't have to dig yourself out of a hole to figure out how you're going to engage science. A gift to me at this phase of my life has been being a pastor of a very liberal / progressive church where people aren't digging out of the same hole necessarily that I'm, so familiar with. And one of the ways that frees them up is that all of their energy doesn't go into trying to reconcile these two, but they're starting not in a deficit. And so all of their energy goes into trying to understand science. So of the, dozen people we had in the room on Sunday, I would say that 10 of them understood science better than I do. Because they're not starting in a deficit and then trying to get out of it. They just get to start. They just get to begin trying to understand what science is doing. And it was awesome. It's like, honestly, one of my favorite things is just when people, and we could talk about sexuality, or there's so many other topics, but when you're not starting in a deficit, all of your energy gets to go to constructive understanding. And so I got to hear perspectives in the room that were really wise. There was a lot of wisdom in that room on Sunday morning. So I enjoyed that. But the second thing I thought was even more interesting is that every single person in the room had at least one story of where science had gone astray and had either hurt people or maybe had lost people's trust or something. And, but every single person in the room, like, so for instance, there was apparently a morning sickness drug was it the 70s? That ended up in
the 50s.
Oh, in the 50s.
50s and 60s. It's thalidomide, yes.
Okay, that ended up causing birth defects. But every single person in the room had a story of say birthmarks that were like radiation X-rays were used on, or different things, agriculture examples of pesticides or herbicides. And yet every person in the room was able to put that in some sort of a framework where, like, yes, that was bad, but, we're still learning and science changes, instead of discounting science and saying, and that's why we can't trust, say, the vaccines or whatever it is, right? So those are my two big takeaways from our Sunday morning is, A, if you were never presented that science and faith are adversarial, and you don't have to spend your energy trying to reconcile them. You get to spend your energy just starting and becoming a person of understanding, which then secondly allows you to incorporate even when science is wrong. Like Amy, I was joking that, I've seen eggs be good and then bad and then good again. And we were like making fun of different, right? But there were like 10 examples of that kind of thing. And it was so refreshing to be in a room with people who weren't looking to discount science, but were looking to incorporate it into their faith. And this is the big thing, because they overwhelmingly were saying that both faith and science evolve in human understanding as we progress along, and that they change over time, and that they actually are doing much the same thing, and they're not opposed to each other. And honestly, it's just one of those incredible things for me to be in a room, and I was hoping that this would be the case, with people who are more well acquainted with the worldly wisdom and more familiar with it and more comfortable with it, and don't see it as an opposition or an enemy force. It was really fantastic. And we never got to the actual articles that I had asked everyone to read, because the conversation was so vibrant that we never got past my opening questions. Do you feel like you understand science? And do you feel like you trust it? And that was our conversation. It was fantastic. And I'm still smiling about it. So that's topic one. Any feedback on that?
Yes.
Okay.
So the first of the three articles was observation, that observation is a factor of science, and you need to bring that to the church and use observation.
Yeah.
Well, science is much more than observation. Observation is a very small part of it. There's a whole series of things that have to be done to qualify as science. So simply bringing an observation to the church simply means you're going to come and observe at the church. It doesn't mean anything about science. I don't remember what the second article was because it didn't impress me particularly. The third article was on reductionism.
Yeah.
And saying reductionism is bad because it takes things out of context. Well, reductionism is the scientific method. You eliminate variables so that you can count and see how one variable affects whatever it is you're testing. The problem with that is, it's really good. The problem with that is you might have a number of studies that under a very isolated situation, eggs are bad for you. You might have another study that looks at other variables and said, well, in this case, eggs are good for you. So science is very, very good at getting very clear pictures of a very narrow aspect of reality. But you have to take the studies that you read in context. You have to understand exactly what it is they're testing. That's problem number one. Problem number two, there may be good science and bad science. There may be good studies, well-designed studies, and bad designed studies. People who think, for example, vaccines are bad because they cause autism have heard of one study that was done that was very poorly designed. And there are hundreds of studies that have been done that are well designed that have shown that vaccines have nothing to do with autism.
Well, that is very interesting. I just want to say that I loved the article on the problem with being reductive, because I have seen this in my life and in my ministry, which is that the reductive move of boiling things down to their lowest common denominators, like, for instance, Christianity is X, or what we call scientism. So, for instance, if we talk about miracles, right? And somebody says, well, that miracle couldn't have happened. It breaks the laws of physics, right? That's scientism. And that kind of reductive approach, I think, is what concerns me. But it's interesting to hear that you read it differently.
Well, and that's because they're taking something that's reduced and taken out of context and trying to generalize it.
Yeah.
Okay. The thing is that there are really two ways that we need to be in the world. One is very specific to what's of most advantage to me that I can use, okay? And that's where science comes in, where it's trying to figure out how we can most use things and use them to our advantage. There's another aspect of the way that we're in the world that's about relationship. It's about being connected to other people, being connected to nature, being used for subjective experiences, that there may be no obvious material basis, but there is obvious relational basis in terms of our daily lives. Trying to use reductionism and applying it to relationships is where you run into trouble.
Well, that's interesting.
So I agree with you that reductionism incorrectly applied is harmful.
Wow, that's interesting. All right. Well, our topic again this coming Sunday is we're gonna go back after science and religion. So we'll get a chance to talk about reductive mentality this coming Sunday, and I'm really excited to return to that topic because, we did run out of time, and normally we migrate up here to the sanctuary with about 12 minutes before the service to sort of get everything set up. But because that conversation was still going, we came up here a little late. And so it was really rushed to get ready but everything turned out great. And so.
Well, one other point I want to make is you need to look at who's pushing a particular point of view. herbicides and pesticides and all of that was being pushed by Monsanto, it was to their advantage to sell herbicides and pesticides. So they downplayed studies that showed harm, and they boosted studies that showed benefit. Same with cigarettes. The cigarette manufacturers came out with all kinds of studies saying smoking didn't bother you. So basically, you have to look at who's paying for the studies and what studies are they promoting.
Follow the money, huh?
Yeah.
Interesting. All right. Well, our second subject is guns. And so here's something really interesting that happened on Sunday. So in my little homily, I asked people to consider being friends with three different people. The first was being a friend of yourself. And I used that Abraham Lincoln quote, which I love. Second was to be friends or be kind to people who hold opinions you used to, but have moved on from. And I actually had a couple of people come up to me afterwards and talk to me about that. It was really awesome. That's a point my friend has made in the past, and I've sort of adopted, and I think there's really something to it. But the third person that I considered, I asked everyone to consider being friends with, was somebody who is very different from you or who you disagree with. And I used an example of a pastor from, I think it was Indiana, who after one of the big mass shootings last year, posted on his social media a picture of him and his wife and their, I think, 5 kids. And he had laid out like 50 guns on the church's basketball court, half-court basketball. And it was so anyway, it made its way around social media. And I used this as an example to say, like, what would it look like to try and enter into that person's shoes when I can't find their shoes? I don't know what's going through their head or what is their understanding of the gospel that this would seem like an appropriate thing to do, to use your platform to lay out 50 guns, right? And I just couldn't get my head around it. Well, here's the weird thing. Often on Sunday mornings, I don't listen to the news. I don't watch the news. I get up, I make my coffee, I come in here, and I immediately start getting ready for the day, all the stuff that needs to happen around here. I did not know there had been a mass shooting on Saturday night, but I think the congregation did. So during this third point of my sermon, I could sense something was happening. I thought that maybe the sermon was getting a little long, and so I decided to cut it off a little bit. But then on the way home, I was listening to the news, and I heard about the mass shooting in Monterey Park, and I realized that what may have been going on is that everyone else brought the mass shooting in with them. They might have thought I knew. And then when I was talking about these guns, that I was like intentionally taking on a really sensitive subject. And it was, so anyway, that's why I cut out this part of my sermon. So my third thing I'll talk about today is what I cut out, because I think it's so interesting in hindsight. But I just have to say that it's really hard. I mean, I can't even tell you how many times in the last 5 years that I will find out, like at Sunday school, somebody will go, "Hey, did you see this happened overnight?" And whether it's a mass shooting or some other awful thing. And I wouldn't have known if somebody didn't say it at Sunday school. But I can't tell you how difficult it is to know. The news is so bad so often, and these mass shootings are happening so frequently that, like, you almost, as a pastor, you almost need to have a second sermon ready to go at any given time in case something truly tragic happens on a Saturday and your people they're bringing in their grief with them. And whether you know about it or not, like, honestly, this is happening so frequently that it's really starting, not starting to wear on me. It's just I'm becoming very aware of the fact that you can't keep up with the news these days. And it's a good thing that I write my sermons like months ahead of time. So that way I'm not caught up in the emotion of the situation, but also that I'm not constantly commenting on the news in real time. Like, I'm very grateful that I write my sermons so long in advance so that I'm not being reactive in the moment. But I wanted to say, because I knew we were going to do this midweek debrief, that I didn't know. And I couldn't exactly read why people were they weren't pulling back. They were just sort of watching me, like, where's he going to go with this? So I dropped the final point of my sermon because I thought, I think I've said enough. So then I just did a little recap and said, be a friend to yourself, be a friend to people who hold opinions you used to but have moved on from, and then be a friend to people who are very different from you. And I let it stand at that, and it was over. So anyway, any thoughts on that whole situation?
There's a headline yesterday that said there have been 138 mass shootings in the United States this year so far. It's only 3 or 4 make the news any particular day because there's enough casualties to comment on them. So the odds of you doing that sermon on a day that there was a mass shooting in the news are pretty good.
Oh my gosh. My friend sent me a meme. Let's see if I can find it. It was, let me find the thread that it's on. So you guys know what The Onion is, the fake newspaper, The Onion?
Yeah.
So every time that there's a big shooting, they post the same headline every single time. And it says, quote, "No way to prevent this," unquote, says only nation where this regularly happens.
Yep.
Oh.
What more can you say?
I know. Okay, so let me tell you what the third point of my sermon was going to be, and I would love to hear your feedback on it. So how the sermon was supposed to end was to say, so I started the sermon by saying, I'm going to lose confidence as I go. I'm going to start with a high level of confidence and certainty. You should be a friend to yourself. And then I have this sneaking suspicion you should also be a friend and be kind to people who hold opinions you've moved on from. And then, also I would like you to consider being a friend to people who are very different from you. But I'm descending in my confidence in this point. So when I got to the third and final consideration, my hesitation and why I wasn't super confident in the point was there is a part of me that worries that if we are kind, like for instance, me to this pastor who had laid out 50 guns with his 5 children, right, on the basketball court. But what if his leadership and the model that he's setting for the young people in his congregation, or not just young people, but that what he is presenting is actually facilitating the kind of environment that leads to these mass shootings. Now, I'm glad I didn't make the point in hindsight, knowing that, there had been a mass shooting I was unaware of. But I really am nervous that, because there are certain things that kindness isn't the right course of action. Maybe their confrontation is appropriate. And so I was not as confident with that final point as I was with my other two, because the second guessing is, yeah, but what if that gospel is really dangerous? And as part of what is leading to this epidemic of gun violence, because, of those 50 guns, those weren't hunting rifles only, right? Those are weapons of war with huge clip capacity. And so maybe kindness isn't the appropriate thing in that situation. Maybe confrontation is required. So that's what caused me to lose confidence in that last point, is I am suspicious that version of the gospel that has the Second Amendment woven into it is part of the problem, and that our understanding of redemptive violence, right? Like Jesus died for your sins, is actually part of the American problem. So I would love to hear, do you have any thoughts on this?
I don't want to be the one speaking all the time, but I have some thoughts.
It's a debrief. We're just
people use, people who use Jesus as their example. How often was Jesus always kind in his response to everybody? He wasn't always kind, but he did not advocate violence, at least in my understanding. Or maybe it's confirmation bias on my part. Maybe I'm only viewing the positive statements that I see in Jesus' message, but he oftentimes confronted people, not cruelly, but directly. So I think, we don't always have to be soft and kind and gentle with everybody. I think we can be, there's such a thing as tough love. We can be confrontative as long as we are understanding of our own motives, and as long as we're not being cruel in the process. Judas was hoping to get Jesus to respond violently and to bring about an armed uprising. And Jesus said, yeah, no, that's not the way.
I guess the bottom line for me is I am just trying my best not to be a part of the enemy making machine of us versus them. But man, there is something about that picture that minister posted that just bugs me to the core. Like, what are you doing? Like,
it was so inappropriate. Just, and you talk about finding shoes. How do you?
Oh, finding the shoes, yeah. Yeah.
How do you find shoes that believe you should have military grade armament in an urban environment, even a rural environment? You're not going deer hunting.
Not with that gun.
I just,
yeah.
And that is a person, sorry, I cannot be kind to. I want to take a 2x4 and just smack them upside the head.
Oh my. Wow.
It's such a, we've somehow, the Second Amendment has become religion.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's one of the 10 commandments, and it's the first.
Well, any other thoughts?
I was listening to a show on NPR a couple weeks ago, and I'll have to dig up the name of the author that was being interviewed. He was essentially making a case that part of how we've become so divided in our country is because of the constant influx of news and 24-hour news shows. And he was saying that I think there was a study that showed sort of this direct relationship between how much news one consumes and their level of contempt for the other side. And I am saturated in news. And
You're kind of a news junkie.
I'm like all the time. And I'm starting to try to pay attention to what listening to the news does to me, and to see if it actually is feeding contempt. Just kind of trying to see if that's happening within me, but I don't think the news is what's feeding my contempt. I think it's Christian nationalism. I think it's the words and the actions of people I disagree with.
And it tends to be white Christian nationalism.
Yes.
Promoted largely by white men.
Old men.
Well,
Well, yeah,
unfortunately,
there are
it is.
some young ones I take that back.
Oh, well, you guys stay in the Zoom room for a second. I want to end this. We try and hold it to a half-hour debrief. So we've talked about science, we've talked about guns, and we've talked about kindness, which is the three things I was hoping to talk about. So I want to thank you all for weighing in, and we're going to sign off. By the way, an interesting thing is because of YouTube and Facebook archiving this for later, we can actually begin to use it on our new podcast stream. So people can listen in later and sort of, even if they miss the conversation, they can get up to speed. And so I'm hoping to pick up some more conversation partners by doing that. So let me end that and end this. All right.